Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you get to ask your questions and I do my best to answer them. And before we get into today's question, just let me offer my apologies. I haven't answered or responded to any questions over the last couple of weeks. Just been really distracted. Some of you may be aware, many of you won't, that my mother's been ill in and out of hospital. And so, things have just not been the same around here. Just been a little bit distracted. But we're back into it, and we have a great question that has really challenged me and got me thinking today. The question is, what character trait do you think is most important in Christians today? And it's really challenged me as I've thought about it. What character trait would be most important? And what I came down on was something that I struggle with. I think many of us struggle with, and it's humility. I think humility is probably the one of the most neglected character traits in the church. I think it's something that we've never really given preeminence to and promoted because we haven't valued it for what it truly is. I think too often we've seen humility paraded and put on display, but genuine humility isn't something you can act. It's not something that you can manifest. It has to, for it to be genuine, it just comes from within. And I think that's why we struggle with it, because we've seen it put on, but we seldom see the genuine thing. And I know I struggle with that myself. I know that my tendency is to mask my insecurities and my inabilities and all those things by putting on humility and not letting it grow within myself. I think of what Paul says in 2 Philippians chapter 2, where he says that Christ humbled himself. He became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. And I say that because I think to know what genuine humility looks like, we have to look to Christ and to how he lived it out, because Jesus was humble. It's not that he acted humble. It's not that he put on a display. He was humility personified. And I say that because I think often we have the wrong view of humility. We think of someone as being humble simply because they're quiet. They don't speak out. They're not loud. We think of people being humble people never being bold and never being courageous and all those things. They don't, as I say, they don't speak out. And yet, when we look at Jesus, we see Jesus speaking out with boldness. We see Jesus in his humility being outspoken at times. We see him in his humility being courageous. We see him in his humility challenging what needs to be challenged. It doesn't mean that he's harsh. It doesn't mean that he's brash. But we see him taking a stand with his enemies and the enemies, of God's people. And so we see in him what genuine humility looks like. It's to be genuinely humble, to cultivate humility doesn't mean being weak. It doesn't mean being a bystander in life. It doesn't mean just being silent and just watching the world go by. Even though that may be the impression that we've developed over time. When we look to Jesus, what we find is genuine humility. And this is why I think it's the character trait that is most important. I think that genuine humility is something beautiful to behold because it's rooted in the very character of Christ. It's rooted in the very character that Jesus teaches us to develop within ourselves. It's the foundation of everything that the Bible gives to us, and how we are to approach God, and how we are to approach one another, and how we are to approach our spouse and our neighbor and our friends and our colleagues and everything else. Genuine humility is really incredible. It's really beautiful. It's really powerful when we see it. I think when we look at Christ and we see how he lived and we see the humility that was on display in his life, we see that it's to be the overwhelming and the undergirding characteristic of each and every one of us. When the world looks at God's people, I think it should see a people who see themselves in the light of who Christ is. And so there's a genuine humility that calls them to love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their strength, and all their mind, so that the focus is on Him and other people, not self. That's why I think it's one of the most powerful traits that needs to be developed, because it takes the focus off ourselves so that we don't become bold, we don't become arrogant, we don't become loud, attracting attention to ourselves. We're always deflecting to Jesus. We're always living our ways, speaking in ways, conducting ourselves in ways, passionately, boldly, courageously at times, to bring glory to Jesus. Another reason I think that I think we need to emphasize humility, especially in today's world, is that we're seeing a lot of leaders fall. If you read the media, you'll see that there's been a lot of leaders who have fallen into moral failure. And one of the questions I always ask when that happens is, how did they get there? How did it come to that point where they find themselves? And I'll right up front, I've got to say, I don't know, and I don't judge. I can't judge. I don't know their hearts, and I don't know what was going on behind the scenes to bring them to the point where they found themselves. But biblically speaking, I can say with a degree of confidence that at one level or another, it began with them not humbling themselves before the Lord, and not asking the Lord to make them humble. Because when the Lord makes us humble, He makes us content and He makes us grateful. I say that because I think humility and entitlement are enemies. I don't think you can hold humility and entitlement together. They're natural enemies of each other. Humility produces gratefulness. It produces contentment within us, so that we are content with who we are. We're content with what we have. We're content with what God's given us. We're content with our space. We're with our spouses. We're content with, or spouse. We only have one spouse. We're content with everything about ourselves as we seek to live out of the fullness of Christ. We're content with the knowledge that we're not perfect. We're content with the knowledge that we blow it, but we're repentant in those times. We don't try and hide it. We don't try and sweep it under the carpet. You see, here's why I think humility is so important. When I think about who God has made me and called me to be, and what He's done for me on the cross to enable me to step into that, humility means that there's no room for self-pity. When we're humble, it means that we're seeking God's kingdom and His glory before ourselves and our own, because we're not thinking of self, we're thinking of Him and what He's done to secure our eternal destinies. It means that we're not seeking more than God has given us. It doesn't mean to say we don't have vision for growth and to bring His kingdom to bear. But if He's given us a little, we're content with that. If He's given us a lot, we're content with that, and we don't lord it over other people. We just seek to be faithful with whatever it is that He's given to us. And as a consequence, as I say, we're bringing attention to Jesus, and we're making the world focus on Him and not ourselves. And imagine for a moment the impact if every Christian lived that way, deflecting attention away from self to Jesus, making it all about Him and not about us, living like John the Baptist, who became less that Jesus may become more. I think there'd be fewer stories of great Christian leaders falling. I think there'd be less confusion in the world about what it means to follow Jesus. I think we'd have better examples of genuine humility as more and more people walk out the character of Christ for the world to see. So that's why I think it's probably the character trait that I would pick as being the most important to cultivate in our lives, and why it's so important. Be interested to hear your thoughts. Anyway, until next time, God bless.